theology nerds. This is Trip, and this is a Theology Nerd Throwdown. That's where you come, get your geek out, and we all nerd out together in an audiological way. And today's episode is a special one because our one and only Callid Keith Perry, member of the Homebrewed Christianity, I don't know what you want to call us, like the gurus of audiological delivery, the evangelists for not crappy theology. Anyway, he's an active member of the Homebrewed Christianity posse, and he just had a book come out, A Way to Water. And it's a Theopoetics Primer, and we had an online book party, and that has been edited all up as a delicious treat for you today. So I hope you listen to it. I hope you head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. I hope you get the book because it's Callid. Why would you not want to get Callid's book? Even if you just want to buy 100 copies to give to your friends, it's probably good to do that because, well, you know, you just want to share the love. When you're over at the podcast, check out our awesome sponsors this week. Wesley Theological Seminary, their D-Min program is sponsoring the podcast. And you may say to yourself, like, I've been thinking about getting a doctorate in ministry, but what should I do? How could I figure it out? What does that look like? Well, head on over to Wesley Theological Seminary's website, and that would be wesleyseminary.edu/dmin, and you'll find out about their D-Min program. And heads up, there's a new way that you can do the Wesley D-Min, but in Cambridge, England, which seems like a reasonable thing to do if your congregation's going to be helping pay for your doctorate. Also, Daydocs Films is continuing to sponsor the podcast. So if you are one of those people who use films either to kind of spawn a little conversation in a group where you're kind of help facilitating and teaching, if you're a minister that likes to include them in worship services, or just someone that wants to sit down and think about something, then head over to daydocsfilms.com, which is DEIDOX.com. And you can check out these really sweet short films of individuals practicing their faith in their own unique context. So thank you, Daydocs Films. Thank you, Wesley Seminary. And thank you who all know that you're a deacon just for listening. So we hope you enjoy the podcast and you share the brew. Now, if Jesus has not raised from the dead yet, meaning if you're listening the week we released this and it's Holy Week, then I hope you sign up for the live video streaming event, The Great Debacle. The Great Debacle is a live event where I will attempt to work some moderating magic between Tony Jones and Peter Rollins as they debate the death of Jesus, the cross, that cry of dereliction, its meaning, or the death of meaning for us today. So Holy Saturday, 10:30 in the morning, if you're like me on LA, then just get up, have some fun. So head on over to Homebrewed and sign up because it's a free e-ticket. You get the link, and then you join us. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, here it is, Callid's book party for his book, Way to Water, a Theopoetics Primer. Remember, share the brew, peeps. Share the brew.
All right, Nikki, you ready?
Yep, let's do this.
Homebrewed Christianity. Welcome to the book release online party for Callid Keith Perry, Way to Water. Enjoy this. What is about to happen is going to be somewhere between theo-nerdy and completely inspiring.
That's very high expectation. It's a good setup, Bo.
Thanks. Mickey, welcome. It is so good to see you.
Hello.
Hey.
Like one way, yeah, but...
You have been a busy person.
Yeah, I have. But good. It's good.
Oh, good. Hey, Callid, man, since Mickey and you and I talked earlier this week planning how this thing would go, yeah. I had a chance to check out the blog tour, the post that we put up. I am more than blown away at people's response to this. You have to be thrilled at this early response to, I mean, your book is a labor of love.
It is, and it's been. I mean, it was cool for two reasons. One, that the publisher decided to kick in copies for some people so they could read them, because that was cool, because I wasn't going to be able to bankroll that. But then, second of all, that people wanted to. I mean, like I posted the thing on Homebrewed, and I was like, "Hey, anybody want to read some of these?" And like before I had dinner the same day I posted it. They were all gone. And four of them were from some crazy place called England.
Wow.
Which is pretty rad. It was like, oh, well, that's cool. People are going to read it and or like have it in their house and not read it. But then someone could be like, hey, what's that book on your shelf? Mm-hmm. And then they actually read it. That was the trick.
Mickey, you got a hard copy?
I have. Not only is it a hard copy, it is signed by the author.
Oh.
Right? This thing is worth some money now, but imagine 20, 30 years from now.
They're going for like $3 on Amazon used, and it's only been out 4 months, so how much used can it be?
I mean, but this is going to be a vintage author's pressing copy. I mean, and you can actually read the name. You can actually read it.
My theory is that by the time triple-digit number of people know what Theopoetics is, you're going to be famous, dude.
We just have to get above 99.
Or a dozen.
That's
weird. But that's what we're doing tonight, right?
That's it. We're trying to get the number increased by 30%.
Your introduction on this book was a tour delight. Not a tour de force, but a tour delight. You actually framed things in a way that I didn't even know. And I mean, I like Theopoetics is kind of a hobby for me. It's not my main staple like it is for you, but
no.
You host on the internet, the World Wide Web, the home of Theopoetics.
Sure. But I mean, this is actually worth getting into, Bo. So it's, when I first got exposed to the word, in 2006 or 7 or whatever it is, I was like, what is this about? And I tried to figure out what it was about and couldn't really. And so because I live on the internet, I'm a super connected guy. It's like how I exist as an academic at all. Is like without the internet, I don't know as if I have the focus to be an academic. And I couldn't find anything about this thing. And so for 5 and 6 years, it became a passion of mine. But like the next piece of work that I do isn't going to be about this. It's just going to be using this. It's not my main focus of work. I ended up putting the website together. I was part of a team of a collective of people who's putting the Theopoetics Journal together. I put the book together so that the stuff was out there, so that like 21-year-old me, but in 2015, if they say, hey, what's this cool thing? There's like a book puts it all in one place. It's not my primary area of work theologically, actually, at all. It's just, it needed to be done. It felt like I love it. And so it seemed like I was the one to do it. Does that make sense? You get what I'm saying?
I stand corrected.
Yeah, I love it. Don't get me wrong. I love it. But this was something that I felt like I had to do. And my work moving forward isn't really touching on this on the topics of it. It will employ it. It will embody it in my writing, but it won't be like more of this book, but just like the second version of it.
You know what just dawned on me, side note, is that all three of us are actually somewhat second career people in a sense. I mean, Mickey's published, but in a totally different field than what she's currently studying in the academy, right?
Right.
And I, as a lifelong local pastor, have just recently joined the ranks of public theologians. So all three of us are actually kind of in transition as far as that goes. I mean,
yeah. And for me, the background is I was a teacher. I was a public school teacher.
Yeah.
I was doing amateur theology on the side, which is where that word came from.
In improv comedy.
Yes, that lasted a lot longer. I only had to give that up when I came to do the doctorate, and it's on pause. It's not canceled.
So listen, in this intro, back to the intro, you framed some things historically that are really interesting to me. And the two I wanted to pick up on, you set the emergence, kind of when it came to the public awareness of this thing of what you're calling Theopoetics, in a very turbulent time in the 60s. I didn't realize that it emerged out of both the death of God and this, kind of cultural turmoil that the 60s knows so well. I found it fascinating that you couched it there early and said it comes out of this because there was a dryness of language about God and religious language. To just seed it there propelled it out of that cultural milieu into something I was totally interested in and kind of captivated by.
So that's interesting. So to some degree, a lot of this book is me working as an archivist, right? As a theological historian, like what came where, who said what, who met who, what conference were they at, like what were they drinking, that kind of stuff. And I just had to edit out the drinking part. That's all that. But what actually I think is interesting in some of the argumentative or like synthetic work that I did other than like archival historical work is some of this framing. And I wouldn't say necessarily that there was a dearth of rich religious language in the 60s, but that the people for whom Theopoetics was important, and there was a small kind of a cadre of them, their sense was that religious language was on the way out. And I can understand that. There's all kind of cultural reference for that. But it was a crashing of like two or three things. One, it was what people perceived to be the end of Christianity, right? It's right prior to the God is Dead cover on Time magazine. People really worried about it because of the countercultural revolution that's about to kick up in 68, 69 and get into the student revolution around the globe. It's less than a decade and a half after the founding of the discipline of theology and literature. And it's like the first generation of people who are conversant with the kind of phenomenological work that was happening continentally with Heidegger and to some degree Husserl. And so all of those things kind of slam together, literature and theology, the decline of or perceived decline of Christianity, and then some tools from Continental philosophy, particularly Heideggerian phenomenology. And then out of this fertile thing grew Theopoetics, and then very early on a dash of critical reflective reasoning in terms of the scriptural studies came in. So we had literary reading of the Bible with kind of phenomenologically inflected theology, plus a cultural context in which everyone was worried that the church was going to end. And suddenly we realized we need to have a more aesthetic, more embodied, more like, relational kind of theology that like talks to the kids these days, right? And you can kind of imagine the really like cheesy late 1960s pastor who's like, we got to talk to these kids with a long hair somehow. And really the origins of Theopoetics in the late 60s, and I know some of these people now, it was really tied around the need to renew language to figure out how to talk to these kids who felt like the church didn't matter at all. And that's a little bit of a different flavor than it currently has now. There's certainly a line there, but early on, absolutely, it was because people were afraid. And by and large, the reason why the conversation kind of fell off the radar of the academy or anybody else by the mid 70s is because we have the rise of the Christian right. You couldn't in any conceivable, arguable way look at the incredible rise of evangelism and radio and TV and all of these people who, with Billy Graham and the Crusades and the Bakers and everybody that were becoming very public figures. You couldn't say, oh, the Christianity is on its way out anymore. It looked like Christianity was about to like win the whole thing. And so it wasn't until the end of the 90s when Christianity, especially the evangelical monolithically perceived Christianity, kind of began to be questioned again, that we see it pop up again. And in that whole intervening 25 years, it kind of lived as a very rarely cited kind of footnote on a couple different authors' shelves, and it was till like 96 that it showed up again. Which I think culturally is a very similar time to the late 60s in lots of kind of contour ways.
And so, Callid, I really appreciate that kind of historical overview. I think that helps place it within the discussion of, different kind of, modes of theological thought and just kind of, I mean, it always helps to have a historical kind of reference point. But I liked how you also in that short introduction, right? I mean, Bo is right. We could really spend the whole time tonight on the introduction alone. Like, it's very rich. And I think because you give both the historical and kind of the different components, right? You stretch it out and try and get a good look at what are the components of Theopoetics. But there's a small phrase that you use early on, page 2, that Theopoetics is described as an entire way of thinking. You kind of go on to talk about how it takes on theology by not allowing it to think of itself as the only way to think about God. It is an entire way of thinking. I would love for you to talk about that a little bit, like how it's a way of thinking that doesn't kind of get stuck in its own, or is that a danger, that it can get stuck in its own way?
So this is, I think, interesting, right? This is J. Denny Weaver, who's done some of the most significant work on atonement theology, and nonviolent atonement theology.
Right.
It's interesting that this is the guy who's writing the preface to, by the way, a book of poems. This is a preface from a book of poems by Jeff Gundy. So he and I aren't completely on the same page with this, Mickey, but I mean, the line is, well, a non-poet's definition of theopoetics might be that's a hybrid of poetry and theology, but to call it that misses the mark. It's an entire way of thinking. From the side of poetry, it shows that ideas are more than abstractions. They have form, verbal, visual, sensual, and are thus experienced at least as much as they are thought. What one learns from the theology side of Theopoetics is at least as much importance, I would say equal importance. One observes that theology is more than an abstraction. It's a way of thinking, visualizing, and sensing images of God. And at that juncture, theologians should become aware that traditional theology is a way to think about the divine, but is only one of a multiple ways to consider God. Now, what Weaver does there is something I'm a little uncomfortable with, which is to situate like classical or traditional theology over here and theopoetics over here in some kind of weird binary where like theology sucks and you just need to do theopoetics and that's what you should be doing. And by the end of it, I hope it's clear I kind of reject that binary.
Yeah.
And what I'm suggesting is, in fact, that may be useful, like if you're trying to get a handle on it, which is why it's on page 2. but what I want to do is kind of like poke at that and say, is it really like one is better than the other? Then we have another problem where then this is the thing you want, and then this says where empire lives, and then this is where power is at, and you can control people via this because you're doing a better job up here than these people who are doing classical theology down there. And so by the end of it, I'm not really interested in that either or binary thing. But to start with, it is worth saying, yes, it brings in the flesh, it brings in aesthetics, it brings in creativity. It's a kind of genre and a style even. So here's a perfect example. Here's a perfect example of what has happened to me as a result of kind of being immersed in theopoetics for a long time. Jeff Hofsklaw, who is a theologian that has, I think, done some stuff on the show, or he's connected on Facebook, yesterday posted on Facebook, what's the most important thing about the Trinity? I want to crowdsource this, everybody. The most important thing about the Trinity is : and he wrote like underscore. And so everyone was supposed to, in the comments, kind of like write in their own thing. And it's like 40 or 50 of them. And I'm reading through them, and I'm like, oh my God, everyone has missed the point. So I post mine. The most important thing about the Trinity is people still talk about it and find beauty and inspiration in it. Right? So this is just what happens to me. I think in terms of the genre. I think outside of the actual discourse, above the discourse. I mean, on a good day. Everyone else is talking about mutual indwelling and perichoresis and how it's the mystery and how the three are one and all these doctrinal commentaries, which I have opinions about. I think it's worthwhile to talk about those things. But when I think about things, I think about the genre that the thing is in and what the implication of that is for society around it, not just thinking within inside of the doctrine. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and that's
an object lesson.
Yeah, that's really interesting though, because you made it clear at the beginning that your primary work isn't in theopoetics, right? But it's the tool that you utilize. So it's interesting to me that you would kind of approach this conversation the same way, right? So the reason you had to delve into theopoetics was because you wanted to use it, not because you wanted to stay kind of stuck in just talking about theopoetics forever. You know what I'm saying? Like, in order to, it became something that you had to understand in order to use it better for the rest of your work. And so maybe that's a good way to look at theopoetics, is that not only is it a way of thinking, it's a way, to me, when we're talking about, it being enfleshed, right, it's a way of being.
Yeah.
It's a way of moving through everything else we're moving through. Because really, there's a poetic sense about other art forms, right? There's a poetic sense to dance. There's a poetic sense to music. There's a poetic sense to improv, So it becomes a way we move through theology, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I've been in some significant conversation recently with Patrick Reyes, and who's a colleague of mine.
Good guy.
Yeah, also wrote one of the posts.
Sorry, Callid, that's Dr. Reyes to you.
Excuse me, Dr. Patrick Reyes.
All right.
And what has happened there is we've talked a lot about how even in its inception we need to start pushing, and this has been a conversation among some of the people who are editors in the Theopoetics Journal, that the term and the idea and the thought was so almost disappeared. And as a result of almost disappearing, a lot of the work regarding theopoetics in the early 2000s or late 2000s and then the early 2010s has been like theopoetics. It's been about theopoetics because there was this need to redefine, reclarify, demarcate, figure out the utility of it. Why is it different than narrative stuff or post-liberal or blah, 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 blah. But there's been a fair amount written about it outside of people than me. I mean, some of the best stuff that isn't me, and it's referenced in there. And so now we got to do it. We got to figure out if we care about this thing that's a populist, theological, embodied thing that cares about the margins more. You can't just keep talking about the margins. You have to start doing that work. And so if I keep talking about theopoetics, I'm going to continue to talk about this gobbledygook language that only matters to certain people. And it matters to me. I'm one of those certain people. However, what matters to me way more ministerially, which is my first vocation, is to enact it, to do it, to actually spend my academic career engaging in such a way that the world is different outside of the academy. Do I also hope the academy is different as a result of me? Yeah, sure. But that's way, way down the list compared to actually doing stuff that's ministerially efficacious, which is making people's lives better.
Yeah.
You quote a guy named Paul Ricoeur, who I am under the impression is the most amazing thinker of the 20th century. I'm going to read you a thing that you wrote in the introduction, or that you quote in the introduction. I would like you to then, for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what theopoetics is, I would like you to tell them what the heck it is, or why you can't tell them.
Okay. Like if it's a secret club, is that the premise?
If it's Gnostic wisdom, you need to say that tonight.
No, it's not Gnostic.
Paul Ricoeur. It is an age when our language has become more precise, more univocal, more technical, that we want to recharge our language, that we want to start again from the fullness of language, beyond the desert of criticism we wish to call again. In every way, something has been lost, irremediably lost, the immediacy of belief. But if we can no longer live the great symbolisms of the sacred in accordance with the original belief in them, we modern peoples, aim at a second naivete. What is the poetic?
The reason I use the Ricoeur there, and that's a kind of a smoshing together of a passage from the Symbolism of Evil. I think it's page 351 or something like that in the original edition. The problem with the way that second naivete gets talked about a lot of times is the same way, and I've been schooled by the very wise Blake Huggins on this, the way that a lot of people think about deconstruction, which is that you've got to deconstruct your faith and then reconstruct your faith and have like a more robust faith. Similarly, the way I believed as a child was my kind of naivete, and now as a grown-ass man, I have my second naivete, and I really have a full faith. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I think Ricoeur, and I don't think that's what Ricoeur is talking about, more importantly. I think what Ricoeur is alluding to and is pointing to in this kind of post-critical move, this second naivete, is an understanding of the reality of criticism, right? He says, yes, we've got to be critical. We've got to do textual, hermeneutical stuff and be like, yo, that was all written by men. Oh, yeah, by the way, those men all, were in charge of the world and had all the power. We can't just read it the way we would read a stop sign, which is to say translucently, stop means stop. We got to read it with some thickness, with some interpretive lenses on there. However, if we only merely read the world with interpretive lenses and don't think it's capable of doing anything other than doing kind of hermeneutic and critical reads, well, then we live in this critical desert. And so the book's called Way to Water because of Ricoeur's line there that beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. Now, maybe, and I ultimately say at the end of the book, maybe that's just a wish, right? I'm not super off with Feuerbach in some degree. It's like maybe it's just us projecting that we want to be called again. But to reject the idea that we want to be called is just us wanting it as somehow just like irrelevant, I think it's bogus. So I say, in the very least, let's set the bottom level and say that maybe it's possible we want to be called again just for our own kind of wish fulfillment. I'm down with that. That means it's important enough for us to care about. But that's the bottom level. Higher up, we may actually be wished to be called into contact with the Holy Spirit, the living Christ, within which we've had baptisms and we have new life. And part of my own personal narrative is like I've had some crazy shit go down, and I have a different life now as a person of faith than I did before. And it's not a one-shot thing. My entire life has been flipped around because of my engagement with the church and the movement of what I perceive to be the Holy Spirit within it. And so for me, the calling again is like a real deal thing, and I could talk to you about dates and experiences in my life that has to do with. But I don't think that the calling again is a once and done. So now I'm in my second naivete. Before I was in a first naivete, and now I'm second. No, it's a constant inbreaking of the possibility of the Holy Spirit. For homebrew listeners, it's going to be very resonant with Caputo's perhaps. And the peut-être, we're in Derrida, the possibility of maybe it is, and that's because those thinkers are instrumental into the current kind of dialogue regarding theopoetics. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I am a Christian theologian. I'm not a radical theologian. I'm a constructive and practical theologian. I'm going to posit the presence of the Holy Spirit experientially. I'm not going to argue from that point that you need to buy into it, but I'm going to tell you that that's my frame. And if you want to come on board with the work that I'm going to be doing, that's where we're going to start from. And for me, that's the case. There's a living God, and by virtue of the baptism that we each participate in the Holy Church, it's possible that we each have something to say about how God is, how God works in the world, and what our relationship to each other and to creation is as a result of the presence of the Holy Spirit in our baptism. Check.
Mic drop. So it sounds like you have what we call in evangelical circles a good salvation story. I know you don't understand that language, Callid.
But
I
do. No, I do.
I mean, call it. And it actually made me think of when you get saved once, right? But then you keep going back down front in the when you have the next youth event and you rededicate your life. So that's second.
Right. But I mean, but the logic there is that the last one didn't take. Right, and that's what I say is bupkis. No, it is in the constant going back down to that we actually engage in the life of faith. If we think that one single action is supposed to do it,
it's one, Callid. You have a salvation birthday.
Yeah, well, I have a salvation.
But seriously, actually, that actually kind of makes that make sense. It's not about a one-time thing. It's about continual renewal.
Yeah. Or you could say maybe it's not that it didn't take, but like let it take again. Let it take again. Take me again. Yeah. Lead me beyond the present again, God. Like let me see another glimpse, another glimpse, another glimpse.
So, we can't stay in the introduction for forever, but I do want to.
Mickey, are you sure we can't?
We could, actually. From what I understand, there's a whole session at AAR just on the introduction to Callid.
Okay.
No panels. No book panels. No book panels.
But I did want to kind of talk about identity. And, you addressed how kind of the early theologians who played around with theopoetics were brought in issues of power and bodies and representation and self. Yeah. And you also mentioned that even during the time of your research and writing this project, how dramatically your life changed, right? Like having a child and entering parenthood and moving around and just lots of changes. How has that interacted with your understanding or use of theopoetics as your own, even what you're bringing to the table, right? Your own personal identity has gone through changes and has evolved.
I mean, so it's actually related to the earlier thing that I said about the way I responded to Jeff Hofsklaw on Facebook, right? So I'm always going to be this guy who wants to know the context of a thing. My Melanie Dugan May, who I love with all my heart, was my advisor for my MDiv, who helped me oversaw the writing of this, which was my master's thesis that got changed into some stuff. She said she once told me that she's pretty sure I'm one of the very few people that she thinks would be content to spend the rest of his life working on the prolegomena to something. I'm constantly asking the before questions, and to some degree she's right. Like I'm always interested in the before, the context, the situation of it, and so therefore I've got to be aware of my own situation in terms of my own writing, right? So I'm a dad, I'm a failing husband, sometimes a successful husband. I happen to be gifted either by genetics or predisposition or God with a really good memory and the capacity to read fast and not get car sick. So there's certain particularities about my own being that have allowed me to be a writer and a thinker in a certain way. And part of those are about my skill set, but they're also about my skin color, about my genitalia, my perceived sexuality, all these kinds of things. And so for me to be doing what I think is good theology and not acknowledge those things, or at least try to acknowledge those things, regardless of what I'm talking about, it's somewhat off. I have a problem, for example, with the only people who talk about race and gender and sexuality and privilege being the people who are writing about race and gender and sexuality and privilege. I am curious and hopeful that one day the theological discourse is full of people who are asking all kinds of doctrinal questions that have, on the surface, nothing to do with race, gender, class, and privilege, but are fully aware of those things and talk about them because they matter for everything. Yeah. It's not a niche topic. It's not something that you talk about just because you're interested in gender studies or race studies or sexuality studies or queer studies or blah, 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 blah. Whatever you're doing in theology, I think, if you haven't fully integrated the experience of the bodies of people who are marginalized, you're not doing the job as fully as you could. Can you still be brilliant? Hell yes. But for me, and I think the theopoetic insight there is we need to be paying attention to the aesthetic experience of other peoples. And that means people with different bodies, people with different views, people who live in different parts of the world. And we should be paying attention to that as a style and as a genre, regardless of what we're writing about, even if we're not writing about gender or sex or privilege. Does that make sense, Mickey?
Yeah, and I think it's wise to start in your own body, right? Because I think that's why it's so easily dismissed, because it's seen as a thing that they bring, right? Like everyone expects me to talk about theology, but white guys, you're just somewhere hovering above theology, above it. So you don't have to bring that. It doesn't taint your theology.
Enough. This is one of my definitions-ish of theopoetics.
Okay.
Theopoetics is an acceptance of cognitive uncertainty regarding the divine, an unwillingness to attempt to unduly banish that uncertainty, and an emphasis on action and creative articulation regardless. It also suggests that when the dust is settled after things have been done and said in the name of God, the reflection and interpretation to be done ought to be grounded in dialogue and enacted with a hermeneutic of hospitality and humility. Break down a couple of those pieces. Yes, it's the case that we can't ever know God and God's fullness, but I can't know my wife and my wife's fullness, so what's the big deal? Let's proceed. I'm also unwilling to attempt to unduly banish. I'm not going to try and enact some scientific, firm theological sayings that I can know God and all the way I can know how God's going to act or God's going to judge. I can't know it, but instead of shutting down, which is often the case for many Protestant mainline folks, and just say, well, I can't know anything about it, so I'll just say nothing, you actually have to go and do and act regardless. And you're going to screw it up. So sin boldly, but sin boldly in the attempt of justice. And when it's done and you've done that creative action and articulation and you realize you fucked it up, well, then polish some stuff up, but polish it up together in a community with bodies that are different than yours so that you can figure out how to do it better next time and then do it again, but do it better next time.
Oh my God.
That's beautiful theology right there. We got to do some things before we go to the blogs. There's 2 sections I really want to get to in the book. When you start talking about Catherine Keller, or when you talk about Catherine Keller, right, you talk about her analysis of the Theopoetic traditions and the 3 distinct streams.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to talk about that a little bit, and maybe you could even address, you and I have talked a little bit about how I feel like there's Theopoetics throughout other traditions, especially I see it in womanist theology, even though I don't know that it's so much been named that or called out as anything like that. It just seems to be part of it. And I will say, even as part of my indigenous theology studies, it's something that we tend to employ is this poetry as a way to break out of what they expect of us.
Yep.
And so that's actually been a big part of my journey throughout seminary, has been to use poetry, to use prose, to just break out of this, write this and document that, and write this and document that. It allows me to just let the stuff come out of me as I process it. She presents these 3 streams, but on the other hand, I feel like it's happening other places, and maybe...
Good. Yeah.
How do we acknowledge that?
So 3 things. Okay. So first of all, a clarity that on the one hand, yes, I am talking about poetry, but I'm also more broadly talking about poetics. So oftentimes what happens is people think that what I'm talking about is poetry related to God. Kind of. Well, here's the distinction I like to make. When you read a poem, you're not merely trying to extract meaning from the poem. The poem itself is the art object, and you're trying to experience that object, part of which is engaging with the content of those lines. Another part of it is where the line's coming from. What does the narrator sound like? We know that the narrator isn't necessarily the same thing as the author. We know that the breaking of the line matters, the spacing on the page matters, all these kind of contextual things, which will sound very familiar to the conversation we've been having. And what I'm interested in is the poetics. That is to say, when we view the piece, the theology, can we accept the piece as a piece itself, an art object, a created thing, instead of just trying to think that the only thing that matters about it is the data to be mined from it? Yes, the data, sure, but also how it takes up the page. How does it take up the social discourse? Does it allow voices? When you flip to the bibliography, is everybody white? Is everybody male? How does it take up space, right? View the theology as an object, not just a thing to be mined for data. And part of that is the style, the genre of writing. So, yes, poetry and poetics more generally. So that's the first thing, just in terms of a clarity there. It does end up being that a lot of times people get turned on to this stuff because they're interested in poetry. They read some Rilke or they've listened to KRS-One or whatever, and they really engaged in perichoresis, engaged in perichoresis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now, back to Catherine. So Catherine has three distinct kind of streams that she talks about. She's accurate historically. I'm going to talk about what her three streams are and then tell you kind of my take on that anecdotally. So Catherine says, Catherine Keller, who has been an incredible host to me. She's been very generous with her time. When I was still a middle school teacher and was like teaching myself theology because I had a library card, she met me at like an AAR and was like, who's this guy? and was like super open. And she was like, hey, you should come down and be a panelist at my thing. Like, transdisciplinary colloquy. I was like, I'm a middle school teacher. She's like, nah, it doesn't matter.
She is incredible, generous, gracious, insightful. I am smitten with her theology.
Well, she did say that she loved you at the AAR.
No, she said Jesus loves me.
That was it. So she was very generous and an incredible host to me, and then connected me to a lot of other people, including some folks out of Claremont, which is kind of how I got connected to this whole crew. So she says there's three ways in which this kind of rich, aesthetic, embodied, God is present in the world, flavored theology exists and gets termed Theopoetics. The first is when Theopoetics is kind of Hellenized, or when you look at it as a Greek word, right? Theopoetics, and that's theo, God, and then poetics is from poesis, and poesis is the verb to make or to do, but it's particularly to make or do in a creative or new way. So like if you make a decision that's like deciding to eat breakfast tomorrow, there's a different Greek verb for that. Whereas if you make a poem, which has never existed in the world before, you use it to make, that's the poesis, right? So there's making in a repetitious, habitual way, and there's making with inspiration, with newness. That's poetics. So poem is simply a made thing, right? So Theopoetics is, how does our language make God? How are we making our understanding of God through the creation of our language? And she says, this thread is throughout the Eastern Church, right? And it sometimes is translated, and in fact, Stanley Hopper, via his student David Miller, who's still around and does really great work in depth psychology and Jung, says that Clement of Alexandria is actually one of the first articulators of this idea of Theopoetics is theosis, right? That how we talk about God, how we pray, how we participate in the world, actually physically, tangibly, is related to entering into the divine energy, right? Energy. That theosis is possible, that we can, in the physical flesh, become more connected to how God is acting in the world. It's not fully separated. We can actually participate in it. And Catherine says, yes, this Eastern Church tradition is actually the earliest and the first of the Theopoetic streams. And then she goes on to say that there's kind of the death of God theology, which is the kind of, which in Theopoetics is a guy named Stanley Hopper, who was the founder of the first United States program in theology and literature, which was at Drew University, which is where Catherine teaches. And she says, how did she say it? She says it follows after the work of Altizer and Bill Hamilton, right? So it's very death of God-y, and it means that whatever we meant by God is what we mean before, so we have to figure out a new language for it, or something like that. And then the third and final one that she says, and the one she's on board with, is what sometimes gets called the process Theopoetics, which it says has some things in common with the part 1 and part 2, but she says in general both part 1 and part 2 are still too embedded with a Platonic metaphysics, and the kind of object metaphysics doesn't work. If you're really interested in making, then you've got to be interested in the process of making, and so then you need a relational kind of metaphysics. And so Theopoetics is relevant because we can kind of understand everything as constantly being in the process of being made. And so what we would normally treat as an object or kind of a doctrinal certainty is actually kind of just the intersection of, and then you can insert some process language about the kind of the prehension of things, whatever, you insert process language. Catherine doesn't do that, but like there's a metaphysical process reason for understanding things, and it's not because of states or Platonic facts or kind of states, capital S, of things. It's because things are on their way to becoming something else. And, here you can insert a piece from a poet, Stanley Kunis, who says, the poem is never done. You've simply stopped working on it. Mm-hmm. Right. So this kind of idea in terms of a process theopoetics is there. And Roland Faber, who's the head of the Center for Process Studies out in Claremont, is huge on this, and he says essentially what is happening is you're opening up an indeterminate field. That what you're doing in process thought, read as Theopoetics, is kind of opening up this question where you have a range of questions that emerge, and you're never willing to kind of nail one down in a kind of Platonic form kind of way. You're willing to just name an issue and kind of hold it out there in the open. And you can say that in different ways. You could say that in a more Derridian flavor, and say that you're kind of engaging around the Cora. You've kind of opened a space, which is the midwife to all meaning, right? Things can pop up there. And anyway, there's other ways to talk about it, but Catherine is on the tail end there. And I think that those three track historically. I mean, she's accurate. Like, I think that that's the case. But my concern, kind of ministerially, is that if we say that Theopoetics is about embodiment, it's about kind of creative articulation, it's about contextualization, it's about allowing the register of the discourse to sound differently than it usually sounds, or sound differently than it sounds when it's in power. If you mark those kind of markers of Theopoetics, well, that sounds an awful lot like womanist writing, or that sounds an awful lot like queer theory or any of these other topics. And the anecdote is a colleague of mine, Tim Jones, who's a kind of a brilliant homiletician, African-American preacher and pastor and doctoral candidate in homiletics, recently wrote a review for Paul Scott Wilson's recent book, who's kind of the 4-page sermon. It's a classic kind of liberal preaching text in a homiletics 101 class. And in that book, Wilson engages very significantly with Theopoetics in the first 2 chapters. And so I got Tim, who's a homiletician, to write a review of it for the Theopoetics Journal. And he does a great review, really engages a lot of particularities. And then, like, in his last paragraph, he's like, and I'm very excited that Paul Scott Wilson, who is this like giant in the field of homiletics, is really interested in this. It's really important to kind of preach with some uncertainty, but with passion, acknowledging context, like really paying attention to the flesh, letting the community speak back to you. And the Black church has always done that. But Tim's point is great. And this has been said to me, who told me? It's Kate Kallman, who's just a brilliant colleague of mine, too, works in kind of queer and feminist theologies. She's like, I actually think Theopoetics is important because it may come to some of the same conclusions as Black theology or womanist theology or queer theology or anything else, but its starting point is aesthetics. Its starting point is genre and style and context. And in so doing, by starting there, it invites people to the table who might not come with us.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I just think she's right. So Kate Kallman.
Okay, we can get to my other thing because it's another chapter if you want to play the game first, though.
Are you ready to be on the clock?
Sure.
You remember we did this last summer?
No, it's fine. We're good. We'll do it.
You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Rubem Alves.
Rubem Alves, in addition to Walter Wink, is one of the reasons I can call myself a Christian. His book, his theology in general are incredible. And Brazilian psychoanalyst and the father of liberation theology before Gutierrez, but was forced to change the title of his book from Liberation Theology to Theology of Hope because, quote, liberation isn't a theological topic of interest. And that was 2 years before Gutierrez published his Latin American liberation theology. Beautiful, beautiful man. Presbyterian Brazilian theologian, did his doctoral work at Union, and really was writing in exile. The military coup in Brazil kicked him out of South America and put him in North America, and so he had to kind of write in North America because he couldn't go home because he was on the watch list for being a sympathizer with the bad guys. So ended up writing this theology where he was wanting to write about the stuff that mattered, about his home, about his people, about the political context, about liberation, but was forced to write about some random thing he didn't particularly care about because he was told that's what theologians do here. And it started for him the desire to write in a way that was writing from the body, that the genre mattered, that offered hope through the end of the line, not just with some kind of proof and point and proposition. And it wasn't until the birth of his daughter, Rachel, that he felt like he could switch. And after he had the birth of his daughter, this is apropos to Mickey's earlier question, he said, I can't go back and write academic theology the way other people do anymore. I can't. I just brought a life into this world. How am I going to write that way I used to write?
You love this man.
Oh, my God. I cried for like 2 hours when he died this summer because I had plans to go to Brazil. I was learning Portuguese almost exclusively for the purpose of going down there to meet
Wow.
And he died. He was sick, so I'm glad he died. But it was incredibly important to me. And actually, the book is dedicated to him for his verve.
It is.
For his verve. Right. Amazing guy. And if nothing else, if this book kind of exposes more people to Rubem Alves, I can't. That would be sufficient.
Melanie Duguid-May.
Melanie is a dear friend of mine. She's the most significant academic. That's a lie. She's the most significant mentor I've ever had in my life. She cares profoundly about my person and my life and my wife and my daughter, because that's what mentors do. Brilliant. She has a recall that makes Trip look like a child. It's astounding. I mean,
wow.
It's astounding. And Melanie she never wanted to play the game of academia, and she taught theology for years. She still teaches in Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School in Western New York, and she doesn't really hang out at AAR anymore because it's too full of pomp and stupid stuff. The thing that's most important to me about Melody that happens actively in terms of Melanie being in my head is when I went away to do this PhD, she's like, look, you're a pretty smart guy and you're fairly competent. Everything about the academy is going to want to make you into the kind of thinker you don't want to be. Be careful. Be careful.
Wow.
Church of the Brethren theologian, Peace Church theologian, was Gordon Kaufman's last doctoral student at Harvard. And was involved for years working with the World Council of Churches before she took the job in Colgate Rochester. I did my MDiv at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School solely based on the fact that that's where Melanie Duguid-May was.
Wow. She kind of reminds me of Marcella Althus-Reid.
Fascinating.
Talked about indecent theology and that it was necessity.
Yeah.
It almost is a protest.
Interesting.
So anyway, that's what it made me think of.
All right.
Number 3.
Okay.
The actor Dennis Hopper.
What?
Dennis Hopper. He wrote on Theopoetics.
Stanley Hopper.
Oh, my bad. I apologize. I thought we were talking about the Hoosiers actor.
Yeah, no. After Hoosiers, he actually went to his underground theology career.
Second career, again.
All right, Stanley Hopper.
Holy cow.
So Stanley Hopper is actually the first guy that we know of, white dude, who in English used the word Theopoetics. And he did it at a talk at AAR, SBL. I don't know this date off the top of my head.
91.
67, no.
That early?
67, yeah. And he used it in a talk called The Literary Imagination and the Doing of Theology. And Stanley Hopper is the guy who was the founder at Drew of the very first kind of department of theology and literature. He was kind of a founding guy there. He was a fellow of the Society for Arts, Religion, and Contemporary Culture. The other founders of whom, one of which was Tillich, and the other guy was the guy who founded the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art in New York. So he was in this kind of art-focused kind of renewal where it was a much more interdisciplinary kind of engagement. And the Society for Arts, Religion, and Contemporary Culture was a big part of what Hopper was doing. He was a theology and literature person, and it was vital that, in fact, this word theopoetics came up for him as a way of thinking about theology, about engaging with it aesthetically and literarily and and Amos Wilder, who for the long time he had written the longest piece about explicitly theopoetics in a book called Theopoetic. Amos Wilder says, kind of unabashedly, he stole a word from Stanley Hopper, and he first heard him talking about it at the third consultation in hermeneutics in Drew University in 1964. So like as early as 1964, the consultation in hermeneutics in Drew, where everyone's talking about Heidegger and hermeneutic-y things, Hopper said the word theopoetics and it stuck in Amos Wilder's head. Amos Wilder is a biblical scholar, not a theologian. And so when he started writing about it, he was writing about culture and Christianity writ large, but he was writing at it from a biblical scholar perspective, not a theological one. And so without Hopper and Hopper saying theopoetics and saying this is what I'm talking about, the category title theopoetics wouldn't have been there.
No, that's interesting, and I apologize for the 1991 reference. That's the year I watched Hoosiers, which Dennis Hopper was in. So I definitely apologize for that. Last one before Mickey takes over.
Okay.
Tell us what Karmen MacKendrick brings to the table.
Oh, dang. So Karmen is a powerhouse of a writer. I mean, she writes. Have you ever had jasmine tea?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you know how if I said to you, like, if you had really good jasmine tea, you would kind of go like, what? Because jasmine tea is such a weird, subtle flavor. Jasmine tea can be excellent, but it's never going to be overpowering. It's going to be just right and subtle. That's Karmen MacKendrick. Karmen MacKendrick is like the most excellent jasmine tea of the theological world.
Wow.
She writes with such a profound nuance, and she's such an incredible close reader that it's just unhandleable sometimes.
Wow.
You want to quit writing. So Karmen, so this is interesting. So she's a theologian. She engages with, but she's not a theologian. She's a philosopher of religion. She engages things from a kind of more or less Catholic worldview. She teaches at a Catholic school, but she writes in a kind of postmodern, Derridian-inflected kind of theological religious scholar thing. And she's really fascinated with flesh and with seduction and with sex. And one of the most recent book, I think she hasn't published anything since then, she talks about how theology is an attempt to kind of seduce God. Not because we actually think we're going to like hump Jesus or something, but because we really want to love. We want to love this being that is always out of reach. And she says when we try to put God in reach, what we've got is porn. Like eroticism and seduction is always out of reach. It's always veiled. It's always not quite seen. And that's the relationship we want with God. Like it's almost there. We almost want it. And if we try to put it straight in front of us, we've got porn. And she says, and I say, so too much of academic theology is Jesus porn. Like we've tried to lay it all out there in front of us like we can see all the pieces. And in reality, the thing's hiding behind a veil. And that's okay.
I'm going to need everybody to tweet #JesusPorn.
Oh my!
All right, what are we doing, Mickey?
This is a perfect lead-in to talking about Peter Rollins. So this chapter has so much in it. I don't even really know where to begin. I found it very interesting, especially when you start talking about justice and the law and hope. Yeah, because I actually think that those go together. On page 103, say Caputo's Theopoetics is about contingency and the possibility of hope, not assurances and fulfilled promises. It's almost like just skip to this chapter and read it first and then go back. I really like, some of the places you were going here. So could you talk about that a little bit? It also goes into deconstruction, right? And deconstruction, criticism, and hope. So
Pete has gone a different kind of place since this, right? So this is mostly references some of Pete Rollins' earlier stuff when he was kind of working more from Caputo's kind of wheelhouse, a little bit more engaging. And in fact, Pete used the word Theopoetics a couple different times earlier on, late 90s, I think. I can't remember what the citation is, but before we knew him in the States and he was just over there doing Icon, he gave a couple talks for some student Christian organizations in Ireland or England and used Theopoetics with no citation references to the stuff I'm talking about. It's just like it's a useful shoving together of word parts. And now he's gone a lot more into the psychoanalytic and Lacanian stuff, which is, I think, intersecting with this, but it's earlier Rollins stuff rather than the kind of contemporary. Although I think that he's on board with a lot of the stuff. And in fact, I think you could think of Icon as a practice out there and the kind of versions of Icon that he's attempted to enact here as a kind of theopoetic expression. So I think that that's viable. But the thread through a lot of this is deconstruction, and deconstruction kind of understood excuse me, in a Derridian sense. And so Caputo there is kind of the American savior of Derrida. He is the American interpreter of Derrida. We're trying to rescue Derridian thought from this kind of bizarre attempt to make Derrida about nihilism. He doesn't care, and because of what he calls slippage and the play of language, nothing means anything, and so like, what does it matter? Like whatever, like the nihilists from the Big Lebowski. And Caputo has said, no, that's a misreading of Derrida. The fact that the law is undeconstructible means that whatever we currently have in place as the law, not the Pentateuchian law, but like just law, means it's insufficient, and that the law that is to be is always coming. This is not the same thing as a Platonic sense of the law, in which the perfect law exists and the current order of it is like some seventh level of reality down, and so it's an imperfect version of it because we've got flesh. That's not what Caputo says. It's that the law itself is undeconstructible. It's always yet to be. It's not yet arrived. And so the purpose of deconstruction is a naming of the fact that everything is always in process of becoming something else. I once asked Jack, so it sounds an awful lot like when you say stuff like that, you're a process theologian. And his response to me was that Catherine often tells him that he's a process theologian, and that the only way he could imagine saying that he's down with process is if he'd had a bottle of wine. But there's an affinity regarding language, right? It's always to come. It's not yet being. And so just deconstruction is an acknowledgement of the state of the impermanence of things and the slippage of them. It is not, and here I'm just cribbing from my buddy Blake, it's not that like, oh, I'm going to disbelieve some stuff, right? First naivete, and now reconstruct it and have a stronger faith. That's not it. It's that constantly within all of the created orders that we have in language, there is this deconstruction, the fact that it falls apart. The word, Blake says, words unsay themselves as they are said. Like that we do this really great kind of beautiful acknowledgement of the language in front of us, and also that it's insufficient and it's not, and it falls apart as soon as we try to engage with it. And I think both Caputo and Pete name this, and Caputo certainly more now than Rollins engages with theopoetics, and his is a very he's a playful writer, but he's still, it would be hard for me to hand like somebody's grandma Caputo's writing, whereas you could hand them Alves's writing, for example.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Did that hit what you want me to hit, Mickey? Yeah, and again, to bring up indigenous theology, indigenous theologians are basically, always, well, some of them are always deconstructing, they're using the language and the tools, of white culture or white Christianity to deconstruct it.
Yep.
And to remake it and to play with it and to, and to kind of spin it back on itself and hold up a mirror.
Right.
Exactly.
Not leaving it where it is. So it's, in a way, definitely theopoetic itself. Kind of, again, we see that in the Black church. Yep. I just recently attended the Proctor conference, right? And you see that spinning something back on itself, using language to deconstruct and to continue that unraveling I mean, it was just, and I was listening to masterful preachers, right? Like James Forbes, who can just take anything and preach on it in a way that I've never heard. So, yeah, I think that was, but I found that chapter really interesting, both, because you were pairing Rollins and Caputo there. Yeah. And they were kind of interacting then with your thoughts as well. So
part of what I'm trying to capture is like them at a point when they're writing about the things that they're writing about. And I hope I did it. I know for a fact that like the confessional thrust of a book like this isn't really going to go down with Caputo or with Rollins. And it's not trying to employ them for the sake of like my stuff, but to say, if you're interested in reading Caputo and Rollins, here's some of the things that you can read that are in resonance with this project, which I am down with.
So before Mickey and I go to the blogs, Callid, I need you to tell me who two people are.
Okay.
Who is Terry Veiling? He wrote the foreword.
Terry is a practical theologian from Australia, Catholic University of Australia, I think is what it's called. And he has done he's got a great book of practical theology, and in it, he really does a great mashup of the importance and the relationship between mysticism and the poetic and the aesthetic. And we had previously connected years ago, because he had read some of my stuff, and I was like, "Who are you?" And I was like, "I'm a middle school teacher." But so then the time came for me to kind of have a forward writer, and I was like, oh, I'm in practical theology. Who's someone that really gets like the importance of genre and style and practical theology? And there's a couple other people in my kind of world or my orbits that matter. But I was like, you know what? Let me reach out to this guy, Terry, and see. And I was like, hey, you probably have no idea who I am. The last time we talked, I taught 8th grade English. But he was like, no, I completely know who you are. I know what you're doing. I'm thrilled that there's going to be a book about this thing because I talk about the concept, and now I've got a reference for it. And he wrote me this like stellar foreword. He gets it. He's completely never been part of our discourse. He's never been to the AAR working group in Theopoetics. He's not been part of it on the ground here in the U.S. Read the book and just got it. He got it. He absolutely got it. And he wrote some poetic. He writes the way I like to write too. I mean, so I really owe a lot to Terry. And at some point in time when I can get my butt out to Australia, I hope to kind of pay that back somehow. But he really reached out and did a terrific job, which is great. And he engages, and his work in the poetic and practical theology is awesome too. So if that's kind of your world, his book is terrific.
Wow. Okay. Who is David Harity?
Dave is a friend of mine. He got in touch with me, I think 3 years ago now, and they had hired Dave Harity who's a poet, has an MFA. He's a writing poet. He's kind of a pushcart nominee. I mean, like he's like a poet. Like that's his job. He like writes every day, like poetry. Like those people exist still. And he was teaching a class there on the importance of kind of reading and kind of grappling with poetry for like ministerial formation. And the premise is something like, if you're not able to engage and read the world and understand it's beautiful, and at least in some ways, well, then like you're missing out on what it means to be a Christian leader. So Dave is teaching poetry at a seminary and comes across Theopoetics, and he's like, whoa, this is a guy who's a theologian who wants to talk about the importance of poetry, but even more important than poetry, he wants to talk about poetics. Who's this guy? And so we connected online, and we have been in like relationships kind of back and forth, emails and phone calls. And then I decided that I wanted to include poetry in this book. And I had originally had some kind of cited poetry in the text and in the manuscript, and then for the full book, I had asked Dave if he wanted to work with me, and so he said he would love to. And what he did is he read the chapter and he wrote that chapter's poem. So at the end of each of the theory chapters, before I get into the applied theopoetics, when I talk about what you can actually do in the church, in each of the books of theory and history, Dave wrote the poem of that chapter.
Wow.
Each of those poems was written for this book as a result of that chapter. And so what I tell people is if you want the short version of this book, just read Dave's 6 poems.
I like that.
Which you conveniently provide on the first page.
Yeah, that's it. They're all there. They're all listed. And that's it. I've said, look, if you're a poet and you want to know what this book is about, just go read Dave's poems because he understands it.
Wow.
Yeah, and I actually did read the poems that with the chapters and found that to be a very helpful way to synthesize what I had just read. So I actually feel like that's nice. And you said he's at the Methodist Seminary in D.C.?
No, that was just a one-time thing. That's how he found out who I was. He was like trying to teach poetry to theologian. He was like, like, they don't give a shit. Like, what am I supposed to do? And then, so he was like Googling and was like, oh, wait, but then there's this guy. And I'm pretty like easy to find online. So we started connecting, and he's now come up and hung out with my family, and he and his wife are great, and our kids have played together, and like he's like a brother to me. He's like a really good friend of mine. We're gonna eventually like continue to write together and teach together, and like there's all kinds of stuff that we get to do together. But he actually teaches at Campbellsville, which is a Christian school down by Louisville, Kentucky, and he teaches creative writing and poetry there.
Right.
But he's a creative writing and poetry professor, and because the school also has a seminary, he's like doing a part-time MDiv to like kind of do the opposite of what I've done.
We want to focus on the folks who took the time and energy to blog through your book.
All right.
So Mickey obviously is going to get first shot at who she wants to engage. But before we do that, I just want to think, and I'm going to read the names of those who contributed. Caitlin Carver, Patrick Reyes, Tahina Rashke, Rick Quinn, Graham Fancourt, Laura Stone, James Hill Jr., John Gill and Gilead 7, Emily Richardson, C. West Daniels, Robin Henderson Espinoza, Jeremy Fackenthal, or who we call JFAC, and Joe Davis. We just want to say thank you so much for your contribution.
Yeah, it was really incredible. The seriousness and the depth which people read, and the way in which they brought their own perspective to the table, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Wow. Callid, you had to be just overwhelmed with how people engaged your book.
That was incredible. And you know, I contain a multiplicity too, right? And so, like, I love that Laura Stone was writing and talking about reading it from a Peace Church tradition. And that Gilead 7, John Gill, starts with a Mobb Deep.
Right.
Like, he's talking about it like, you know, the way that I talk about this stuff, the way that I sound. Like, when you actually meet me, sounds a lot more like John Gill than it does, you know, Peter Rollins, right? So it was an interesting thing because a lot of part of my life showed up there unintentionally, right? So we have queer theologians writing about materiality, and that matters a lot to me, and we have a lot of people working in liberationist stuff, and that shows up. None of that is necessarily what the book is about, but the fact that those are the people who are interested into this made me feel like, oh, okay, I'm doing the right thing. The people who I want to care about this are the people who end up caring about it, and they wrote about it in the ways that they would write about it, not about the way that, like, you know, generic con would write about it.
I loved the bottom 5. If you go to the website and you look at the blog with the bottom 5, I just have to say.
For Emily's blog post, you know, when I could no longer carry on in the academic environment because of the limitations of my body, that was when I needed to find new ways of doing theology. And she shares, you know, kind of some of her story about needing to get away from the academy in that way, even though she was good at it. And I can understand that in that the last 6 months since the murder of Mike Brown, that's, you know, there's been a reorganizing of my theology, and I know it's been that way for many people. Many academics of color have said the same kind of thing. So, how our bodies influence our theology. You know, I think theopoetics allows us to grapple with that, how our bodies impact, or how it's a part of how we do theology.
Right. No, and I'll just correct one thing from my perspective. Theopoetics doesn't allow us to do that. It insists that we do that because we should just be doing that.
Right.
We should just be doing that. Yeah. Jesus, if the doctrine of incarnation is something that we're supposed to care about, then how can we be writing theology that doesn't engage the fact that I'm fat? That I have the ability to be fat, that I have the privilege to be fat. Like, we have to talk about the contextuality of where we're situated. And if we don't talk about the stuff that we got, then what are we talking about? What are we talking about?
Right, but that's such a...
Wow.
But, I mean, that's so different from, right, what became kind of the mainstream, or actually, I'm reading... a book called Red Pedagogy right now, and instead of mainstream, the author uses the word white stream. I love it. It's my new favorite word. But you know, that was kind of not the dominant thought. It was like this out of body Christianity, right? So it really is pulling us back into a different realm to say, no, that's part of it. I do theology with my body and my mind and all of that. These are not disconnected things.
Yeah, and some people have accused me of being anti-intellectual, and I just don't buy that. I just think what I'm trying to do is reframe what intellectual means away from disembodied kind of white male heteronormative privileged thought into an acknowledgement that as a white man with privilege, I'm going to have that anyway, but that I could probably pay more attention to my situatedness and listen better to other people in their situation. I don't try to prescribe one way they're supposed to do theology.
Right.
I want ridiculously thick Kantian metaphysics. I don't want to like them, but I want them there. The problem is when that becomes normativized as the only place that power and authority rests. Right? That's the difference. If we're going to be taking seriously the Corinthians text about the body of Christ in the theological practices that we have, then we got to have really intense metaphysics and kind of continental hermeneutical kind of registers, as well as other authors who are writing in a colloquial voice. Like, we have to have a multiplicity. To say there's one right way to be doing theology, and it sounds like very people-y, like you're going to just reinscribe another kind of monolithic, this is the way things got to be. You have to have it across the spectrum. I just want power to be distributed wherever power needs to be distributed and not reside on people who kind of function within a kind of a Kantian metaphysics or process metaphysics for that perspective. And there are some times when people, like, there was a time when some seminarian friends of mine came to see one of my comedy shows, right? So I'm a comedian, right? Do you think that I'm talking about Kant and, like, Plato and – no. When I'm on stage, I do all kinds of crazy stuff, but I'm not just one thing. We're not just one thing. And we need to talk about that and acknowledge that we live in an ambiguous world where we're all kinds of things to all kinds of people instead of trying to pretend we could do away with that ambiguity.
Okay, so we do have some questions from Twitter.
Can I read the first one?
Sure.
The one that most piqued my interest was this. What makes Theopoetics more than just a post-liberal discourse?
Interesting.
Go ahead.
If the question is specifically about post-liberal in the sense of the school of post-liberal thought.
Yeah.
Then I specifically address why it's exactly not that. So it's in the chapter called Bodies and Tongues. And it is it's in addressing Melanie's work, Melanie Dugan-May.
Right.
Lindbeck writes that language creates the possibility of religious experience, and that religious experience in the sense of feelings, sentiments, or emotions result from new conceptual patterns instead of being their source. So Lindbeck kind of named this by saying, Luther did not invent his doctrine of justification by faith because he had a tower experience, but rather the tower experience was made possible by his discovering the doctrine in the Bible. And I just think that's bogus. We have bodies. We have bodies, if not before we have language, at least in simultaneity with language. And his attempt is, in trying to kind of silo off language culture worlds, and Scott Holland addresses this too, by saying by having language culture worlds above the flesh, then we have weird things where you could say that we're able to have new experiences because of language. Do I agree that we can have new experiences because of language? 100%. But I also think that I don't want to put language prior to experience. I think that phenomenologically, like, we have experiences that are carnal, that are fleshly, that shape how we view the world, and certainly language shapes those. But I don't do the Lindbeckian move of putting language as a precedent to all of that, which is, and neither do the Anabaptist theologians that I engage in the book. And by and large, I would say almost all the people who kind of touch theopoetics with any seriousness would fairly well reject.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because from a developmental perspective, that makes sense. If you just talk about this came up at Faith Forward, because that's specifically a conference dealing with children and young people in faith, right? So talking about how people develop faith, how people develop what they know. So if language has to come first, right, kind of the trend was you have to tell children about God, right? But now there's the swing to helping children experience or understand what they're already experiencing, right? We don't actually give them the experience.
Right.
They're already experiencing God. So that's interesting that you take them to task on that, right? Because
and to be clear,
children need the language first. I mean, they're getting language at the same time, right? But they don't necessarily need that language. They're already experiencing something of the Holy Spirit or God or whatever.
And I'm not like super.
Okay, I have another one from Twitter. Brecky asks, how would someone like Wendell Berry be an unintentional theopoetics theologian?
Good question.
Theopoetics doesn't, as a word, right? The word theopoetics doesn't track so well with like a school. So if the question is, how would he be one? That suggests that somehow like there's like you've got to be this high to like get on the ride. And all I want theopoetics to be another color name that helps us like have a richer experience of colors, right? So theopoetics is like a genre, or maybe it's like the word like luster, just the luster of a color. So you can have a lustrous gold, a lustrous magenta, a lustrous blue. You still have gold, magenta, and blue, but it's got luster, right? So theopoetics is a qualitative shift in the way that a genre or language is functioning, and as a result of that, you actually experience the color differently. It's no longer just gold with a luster or like blue with a luster. Your engagement with lustrous blue and lustrous gold are different. They're not just gold and blue plus luster. You engage the world differently because of this other quality that it possesses. And I think when the way that we talk about theology is more embodied, engages in a genre that's a little bit more poetic and less discursive, so it isn't quite as didactic logically, it doesn't kind of boom, 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 propositionalize itself, that we actually engage with it differently. Are you still making propositions? Yes. Are you still doing the task that theology has always tried to do? Yes. But by paying more attention to the quality of the container of the thoughts, that is the language itself, and by referring back to the quality of the container of the thoughts, that is the body itself, well, then you end up in a different place. So it's not how does he become one, it's what happens if we read him as one, gained by thinking about him in that way. It's not a metaphysical pointer to he's a theopoetic person, he isn't. It's these kind of characters or fields of opening which says it might make sense to think about this in this way because then It's not another choice. It's not like, oh, I do narrative theology, or I do process theology, or I do liberation theology, or I do theopoetics. Like, it's not that. It's a way of thinking about any kind of theology.
Hey, but I actually want to give my final comment to Laura Stone, who was one of our bloggers, and I loved her post so much. I want to read one of her comments, and then I'm going to sign off, actually, with one of her final sentences. You ready?
Sure.
So she says, given the tension, Callid has done brilliantly in assembling a bricolage of thinkers and approaches, of poems, essays, testimony, and vivid images alongside more systematic academic language. That's high praise. I mean, you've really done a lot in this book. I think that anyone who picks it up, whether they are a layperson or a PhD or anything in any kind of spectrum that you could draw, is going to get a lot out of this book. So I actually want to end with Laura's final sentence. You ready?
Okay.
And so are saying, unsaying, dancing, searching, yearning, creating, calming, laughing, resting, and reaching continues.
Yes, it does.
Unresolved, baby.
Unresolved and necessary because we still got black men being killed in the streets, because women don't have the same pay, because you name it. You name it, that's why we're still reaching.
Indeterminate, because language does not contain it all.
We have to keep going. We have to keep going. Until New Jerusalem, right? And who knows when that's going to be, so get working. Mickey, do you, Bo is now peaced out. Thoughts? Where do you want to go as we close out here?
I thought Graham's reflection was interesting, and Graham Fancourt, The Reluctant Blogger, and as a somewhat now former Anglican, the question that he raised was that it seemed very specific to North Americans. Do you have an answer for that? Do you feel like that was just his, where he didn't connect with some of what you were saying? Is this something that connects further than that? I mean, your influences are not just North American. So,
Well, yeah. And so I read it as him saying it's speaking to a North American condition, right? And I mean, to some degree, I think that that's right. So I live in this weird world, right? So my denomination is a tiny little denomination. I'm incredibly Quaker. I'm Quaker through and through. My theology is Quaker. Like, that's my case. But I spent a lot of time outside of my denomination. Who do I spend it with? I don't much anymore, but for years I spent it with kind of post-evangelical, kind of what was called the emergent church conversation people, and in local cohorts in Boston and Rochester, but then also at some of these other gatherings. And I don't so much do that anymore. And by and large, it's like, because they weren't really my people. They have a different story than my story. And a lot of those people are friends. That's how I met Bo, and how I met Tripp, and how I met you, for that matter, Mickey. But those who I've been exposed to, right? So when I go to academic conferences, or I go to do some of the work that I do consulting with churches or with kind of organizations, like, a lot of those people are American Protestants. And I think the zooming out on that comment, the noticing is that I'm talking about the need for more embodiment. And the read is like, well, the liturgical traditions are pretty embodied because of the importance of the sacramentality of it. And so to that degree, I think that that's accurate. But I also hope that, or let me just say this. It is, in fact, to this moment that I am talking. I am writing right now because that's what I'm writing. But my hope would be, and I think Scott Holland says this well, and I don't remember the exact citation, but he's looking to take the importance of the materiality of the world from the Catholic tradition, and the kind of the everywhereness of God and God's presence from the Protestant tradition, kind of with an importance of language as opposed to just materiality, and with them. So I do want a language-rich materiality, and not just the one or the other. And to anyone who cares about that, then that's into it. I've gotten emails because of my website and some of the stuff I do from all over the world. I got these Chinese Christians I'm in contact with, and people from Spain, and people from Brazil and Portugal, and a couple people in Japan. So there's like people from all over the world that I'm like in contact or correspondence with, because I'm really easy to find on the internet, and I talk about this stuff incessantly. But I get his point. in terms of culture and context. The thing that I would say that I think is really important kind of moving forward is that I hope people read it. I hope people engage it. I hope people find in it a way for their own voices to matter and why their own voices might matter. And if they've had their voices stopped up for any reason, either because people told them they shouldn't be talking or shouldn't be preaching or shouldn't be saying anything of worth because they can't, or on the other side because it's not worth saying anything anymore because nothing means anything, or because we can never get the God language just right so we should shut up, or because everything important has already been said. On either of those, I say bogus, and let's talk. Like, the invitation is to have more people having more conversations, and to a large degree, I'm going to be bopping out of this conversation writ large because I've done my piece. And what needs to happen is there needs to be, if it's of worth, then there will be more scholars who are writing from places of less privilege than I am who will find it useful, and they'll say something, and then I'll just say, take a look at that. By and large, I'm done now that this work is done, for a while at least, and we're going to listen and see. And if it takes, then it takes, and then we'll hear what people have to say about it. And if it doesn't take, then this book will go away, and maybe 20 years people will reference this. But I need to be nearly done with it so that we can actually hear from the voices that are not given airtime, and I can use whatever tiny platform I have to point back to those people. And my hope would be that it happens, that this is useful to people whose voices don't get heard often, and that they find some resources in here for thinking about why their voices need to be heard, and in the very least with me, but also some of the other people who are interested in theopoetics, people who want and need to hear their voices in however it sounds. And we'll see. If it's just other people who already have power and privilege writing about how important it is to pay attention to the margins, well, then I didn't really do my job. If, however, it's actually encouraging people to put stuff forth and it gives people a reason to put forth because it matters, then all right, I'll take that.